I don't know if you remember, you'll probably remember the time when T20 cricket was one match at the end of a long tour.
Yeah.
It's usually a bit of fun, you know, a slight commercial opportunity. And now it's sort of taken over the game in a big way. How do you see the effect on Test cricket specifically? And also, I mean, personally, when T20 first came about, I felt a bit like one of those people who would call themselves a purist, who probably wasn't very happy with pyjama cricket and 50-over cricket. I felt like that when T20 cricket came about, saying, is it really cricket? I mean, you only have to manage 20 overs, you don't have to conserve wickets. It takes one part of the art form away, but introduces another. So how do you view T20 cricket overall?
So I share that view. I'm not a huge fan of the format. But you can't argue with what it's done to the game. It's just completely globalized the game. It's brought teams that might not be able to compete at the highest level, like Afghanistan, into the mix, and they're a genuine contender now. So that kind of thing is really good for the game, I think, and guys like Rashid Khan being a global superstar, it's fantastic for Afghanistan as well and for the player. So T20 has given that opportunity, but Test cricket is still number one for me, and I will sit in front of the TV for five days if you allow me to, but
how are we going to keep players interested? I mean, a lot of people, we can see it, I don't want to mention names, but cricketers leave international cricket very early on now because they can get into franchise cricket, make a very good living. On the other side, you can't blame people because it's a career. You're not going to go until you're 40 as a cricketer. It's tough, you can. So there's an opportunity cost to this, and you clearly miss out. The international game will clearly miss out on some very talented players, especially in the Test arena, if we keep going like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem of the individual boards. You know, you've got to make sure you play your players enough that they're not too enticed away. I mean, it happens at football all the time, doesn't it? You know, your friend Alex Ferguson would never allow players to go and play on international duty, and where the clubs became much bigger than the international game, except at the World Cup. So I think boards have to learn a lesson from that and try to make sure that their players play for the love of the country, and their fans also don't just follow the player as some kind of an icon, but like to see him wearing a West Indies cap or a Sri Lanka jersey or that kind
for instance, the IPL goes on takes a big chunk of the annual calendar every year. That surely has to be a problem going forward. I mean, it's 1.5 months worth of one franchise tournament. It sounds a bit
well, a lot of people make a lot of money in that 1.5 months. Kusum, you and I don't, but then certainly the people who
it's
do.
Irresistible now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the boards have also realized that money talks. There's no point in resisting this. I think there was a bit of a fallout with Arjuna Ranatunga when he was president of SLC, and he kind of was not happy about players missing a test match because of the IPL. Rightly so, you'd have to say. But it's money talks, and that has become an irresistible charge.
Is it something to do with the test game itself? Because now we've had, I think, one phase of the Test Championship. It was in New Zealand that won the Test Championship. So, I mean, this is something that I think to give Test cricket and bilateral series some context, a league format makes sense. But it's taken so long for them to introduce this, and obviously so many challenges with the tour schedules and that. But how have you seen the league format for Test cricket? Because I feel like that there's some potential, but is it?
Oh yeah, certainly. And I remember that final that they played. It was an outstanding game of cricket. It really was a fantastic game of cricket. And I think we need to start selling Test cricket to people differently. You've got to look at a session, and that's almost as long as a T20 game. And you've got to start marketing that in a different way. People have to start writing about Test cricket in a different way. I think most of the writers really love Test cricket themselves. So there is a bit of that happening. But it's just people's attention spans, isn't it, Kusum? I mean, people are moving from books to Kindles and from movies to YouTube videos. So again, it's inevitable that we're going to go down this road.
Is it something that maybe we can? It's a relic, Test cricket. Let's be honest. It's a relic, but you can do a lot with a relic. Like you see our relics in Sri Lanka, right? You can do a whole song and dance around it. So maybe we can make something more, and maybe really sort of emphasize the fact that it's not one-day cricket, that you can actually take someone's head off, for instance, with the red ball. Now, that's something that gets the blood rushing, right? You see someone bowling in 145, 150, and you know it's going to be a short delivery. So maybe we can emphasize that a little more. Like, I mean, that.
And the function of that is what the West Indies did to Test cricket in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, you had these guys who were just gladiators, who were out there terrorizing everybody. And that's what I remember. And then you've got your Thompsons and Lillys, and then you've got your Wazims and your Wakas. And this is the reason people watch sport. They want to see a little bit of blood. We've moved on from the Roman Colosseum, but not too far.
Not too far.
You know? Yeah.
I mean, that you mentioned West Indies is perfect because the West Indies mirrors the Sri Lankan cricket story. The West Indies were I mean, obviously, they were untouchable for a time, right, in the 70s, 80s. They were literally untouchable, the best team in the world in both formats. And West Indies cricket lost its way. I mean, even though they had superstars like, Lara and the Ambroses and the Bosch, they won very little, especially abroad, they were very poor records. So the Sri Lankan cricket, we had this brief spell, right, 95 to 99, where seemingly we had the best left-arm seamer in the world because Wasim Akram was injured. We had the best spinner in the world. We had some of the best batsmen in the world. We really milked it. We won several Asian Cups and all of that. How come we lost our way? I mean, you have a lot to cover in this answer, but there's corruption, there's mismanagement, selection issues, all of that. But could you give us a sort of, as a sports journalist, as a cricket fan, how you saw that era, let's say up to the end of the Marvin era from the 96 period onwards?
Yeah, it's a tough one to put a finger on because I think there were several reasons why that happened. I think the players suddenly overnight became real stars. And that's something that's difficult for anyone to handle at any age, Kusum. And you notice that with the Kusal Mendis as well. I interviewed him for Wisden in about 2016 or 17. He was the up-and-coming cricketer of the year. So I went to his house in Moratoa. It was a house not bigger than this studio that we're in. A couple of families living in it. It was unfinished brick. He just made it into the national team. Unfinished brick. There was no color washing on the house, nothing. There was a 3-wheeler in the garage. And then suddenly he's driving a Land Rover and meeting with an accident, and that kind of stuff happens. So it's such a sudden surge for players that it's very difficult to handle. And I think you and I wouldn't be any different if we got untold riches in the course of an evening. That's when our real problems are going to make
as a young adult as well.
Yeah. So I think that happened early on. There's no social media at that time, so obviously we didn't know what the players were up to. Which is now captured on any camera. But I think there was a little bit of distraction for the players at that time, and they thought they could get by on talent. But what happened was the rest of the world started slowly catching up, and the rest of the world has and always will be professional. You take UK, you take Australia, you take New Zealand, you take South Africa. These guys make a living out of being prepared and just getting better 1% at a time. And they continued getting better. And the Sri Lankan talent was just not enough to counter that physicality and the strength and the different dimensions that people brought into the game in that period. And it was only after Tom Moody came in and people like Kumar Sangakkara and Mahela Jayawardene were savvy enough to see that they needed to keep up. It's when Tom came in that things changed a little bit and they started being a little bit more prepared. And that's when we had our golden era. So I think that's really what it happens, a combination of the players maybe thinking they were better than they were and the rest of the world catching up.
You had tweeted recently about, about Bhanuka Rajapaksa and the fitness issues so how do you view the fitness of a cricketer? Because as you said, I've noticed Australians, the British, South Africans, they've become athletes. I mean, proper. Even England used to have a few like, Graham Gooch, who weren't traditional athletes. Exactly. Mike Gatting, the captain for a while. But they've all kind of become more professional. You can see them, they look like they're working out. Jimmy Anderson is a perfect example, right? You can't bowl at this level. You wouldn't have been able to do it in the 90s.
16 years he's been going, right?
No way you can do it in the 90s. How come Sri Lanka still, we see a few of our fast bowls with a little bit of a little extra flesh. It's not a thing that you look at as a cricketer and say, oh, he can't be a cricketer because of this. It's not like other sports. There is some leeway. But do you think how do you view the fitness? Because you're in the fitness industry as well and you know a lot about this sort of thing.
So again, I think it's a cultural thing. I don't think we have a culture of fitness. Like I said, people playing recreational sports, it doesn't happen a lot here.
Right.
You're struggling to find 10 people to play a basketball game on a Saturday afternoon. It's that kind of thing. There are a few hardcore people, but it's not wide enough to really cast a net over and get some real talent coming through. So that fitness culture is not there. You won't find people often just getting up and going for a run. It seems to be something that is centered towards the walking paths that have come up in Colombo. It's not a wider thing where people would throw on their jogging shoes at the lunch hour and go for a 40-minute jog and come back to work. It's not that kind of a culture that we have. So fitness has not been something that a lot of junior cricket coaches have placed a lot of emphasis on, because at that level you can get away with being a big hitter of the ball, a good timer of the ball, all of that kind of thing. And then suddenly by the time they come to the big leagues, being a good timer of the ball is no longer enough, because the ball is hitting the bat so much harder because these guys are bowling at 10 clicks more than you were facing earlier. So then you don't have the tools to deal with it, and that's when players fall by the wayside. So I have heard stories where premier fast bowlers have come into the Sri Lankan setup and seen the inside of a gym for the first time at that point. I'm not even making this up. So, you're in your early 20s and suddenly you're starting to lift a few weights here and there, and then you don't want to be left behind. You might be thinking, if I can't do this, if I tell the coach that I can't do this, then what is he going to say? So players might be pushing themselves a little bit more. So it's a myriad of things. And that's why these people are breaking down, because they don't really have that training age that most other cricketers in their vintage would have in other countries like the US, in New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, because those countries are just, they live and breathe sport.